This is the nameless protagonist, offering the sphere another chapter for your consideration. In the last video, I spoke in detail about the hikikomori of Japan, or those who shut themselves in, and you all expressed an interest in my going deeper on the topic of grass eaters, herbivore men, and their theorized counterparts, himono ona, or the so-called dry fish women. Here, I will expound on those points. The number of herbivores, or grass eaters, is staggering. Nearly 65 to 70% of men are postulated to fit in this category from the ages of 18 to 35. Prime years, the government expects its young men to be forging relationships, making families, and most importantly, having children. But what does this term really mean? The general idea of this term, grass eaters, so-called, comes from a play on the kanji for the word sex, which translates to a union of flesh. So, by replacing flesh with grass gives us the meme used today, thus grass eaters. Like the word implies, there are men who have decided to opt out of sex and relationships, but there's an additional layer applied to it. They have decidedly eschewed the culture's traditional expectations of masculinity, from responsibilities to its images and mindsets. For them, the phrase, "do what thou wilt," is taken to the fullest realization. Free to explore their anima, they do so unapologetically, without constraint. These men live lives that remind you of the hedonistic divas of the West, minus the desire for attention and promiscuous behavior. They invoke the visage of the metrosexual meme of the early 2000s and fully embrace pastimes culturally reserved for women, often with other women joining them. This makes it evident that they are not necessarily hikikomori, neats, or even reclusive for that matter. In spite of this, they make no aggressive action whatsoever in the pursuit of women. In that regard, they are decidedly neutral, or rather indifferent. If something resides outside their immediate sphere of interest, it's left as is, and the pursuit for higher learning or the ambitions of the corporate ladder are left to the wayside intentionally. It's my subjective opinion that the spirit of the historical feudal lords and their relationship to their samurai retainers is very much alive in the modern Japanese work ethic. The idea of it is, quote, not letting down the man next to you and enduring even though you've gone well beyond your means of going forward, end quote. In a word, gambatte can be used to embody this mindset. This results in it being quite normal to have up to 80-hour work weeks with no real vacation taken unless mandatory. Even after the work is done, it's a cultural expectation to head to the bars after work and drink with the boss and co-workers. It's considered a show of solidarity to each other and to maintain healthy rapport. After having done so, your family, should you have one, is already long asleep. It's not unusual for fathers to become a specter that people in their household know of but never actually see. If you are not in a position to have a family with such work hours, doing so appears to be near impossible, let alone being able to maintain a healthy relationship. For most of these herbivore men, this was the relationship they had with their fathers. They knew of them, in theory at least, in heresy, but never got to know them in their proper role, creating a kind of pseudo-matriarchy. The mothers, to speak of them, oftentimes were upset about the situation, but remained as the de facto leaders of the household and final decision makers, thus leaving her to settle heavily in her masculine energy. If this wasn't the case, then she too was busy working to make up for the loss in pay, thanks in part to the post-financial collapse of '97, leaving the children to essentially raise themselves. This has manifested a clear aversion for both the corporate world, which promises to consume their lives, and a family life, which they've never experienced in a healthy model form. At risk of digressing slightly, I'd like to say I find it interesting how those conditions mirror a lot of what black men experience. Although the reasons are completely different, in the end, it leads to a very familiar situation. Perhaps that'd be worth another video in the future, but if this story so far resonates with you, this may be a big contributing factor as to why. But getting back on track. While these herbivore men do not dedicate themselves to relationships or the pursuit of their potential in the corporate world, they do indeed work. However, the nature of the work relies on the principle of, quote, path of least resistance, unquote. In this way, they can maintain their current lifestyles, which allows them the extra time needed to enjoy their own hobbies and indulgences. On the matter of casual engagements, it should be noted that I haven't found any evidence to support that they do not use dating apps. What I do find is a sentiment echoed by many MGTOW adherents, which states, quote, "The juice isn't worth the squeeze," end quote. So if sex falls into their lap, they will take it. Outside of that, it's met with a shrug of the shoulders and deliberate smiles of indifference. Both the women and the government seem equally alarmed about this, the latter of which has gone into full-blown panic mode trying to discover what's going on and why. Many social psychologists have attempted to surmise the situation, citing things like, quote, "the old warrior culture is not being observed," end quote, and blaming the lack of wars not inspiring men to be soldiers and thus, quote, lack of manliness, end quote. I tend to think the answer is much simpler. For one, we've seen this already in the mouse utopia experiments in the form of the beautiful ones. For those who are unfamiliar, these were the mice who developed an obsessive sense of grooming and seemed completely indifferent to their surroundings, especially with regards to mating. Even with that said, however, the more pragmatic side of me thinks this just may be the market, quote, correcting itself after the baby boomer era. What does seem to be clear is that without environmental pressure to have a family, men will do what they can to get by and find less value in taking on what could be considered liabilities, especially if they can be happy with just themselves. This complicates matters for the government, which depends on taxes to pay off its debts. It also hinders the ability to bring bright minds to various sectors of society, such as STEM, global industry, and government leadership, which all require years of education and mentorship. You could call this a brain drain, for lack of a better term. Wonder where we saw this before. Canary in the coal mine indeed, but in any case, what you may find interesting, hidden in the shadow of these herbivore men, is the himono ona, or dry fish women. If I'm honest, I get mixed information about this segment of the Japanese population. The fact that a huge majority of the Japanese in general claim to be virgin, it would be an appeal to reason that a large number of women would in turn be virgin as well. Given that men have, by and large, stopped pursuing women openly, those who are stuck on the idea of traditionalism have found that they are without practical options for marriage or relationships, as they understand them at least, and seem to likewise withdraw from the market, mirroring their male counterparts. Thus enter the dry fish woman. They describe themselves as involuntarily celibate and put up the image of being a normal working woman when they are out in public. But when they get home, they eschew and drop all pretenses of femininity, refusing to shave, pursue romance themselves, and live more like a teenager. The motto they stand behind is embodied in this word, mendokusai, which, if we translate it, could mean annoying, irritating, or too bothersome, obviously referring to relationships in traditional female roles. Many may take the involuntary portion of the celibacy claim with a raised brow of skepticism, and the celibacy portion with a grain of salt. This is due to much of this behavior already being observed in many Western cultures, especially by women in their 30s. It should be noted that there's a cultural stigma and pressure for women to be married by 25. The cultural meme Christmas cake is used as a metaphor to describe it. It's thought that after Christmas, nobody wants to eat Christmas cake, so when it's offered, it's seen as a past its prime dynamic when this word leftover comes to mind. This emulates much of what we saw in China's leftover women, or what we call in the West the wall. And as we've seen in the West, so too the wall appears to be undefeated in Japan, which has led many young women to simply throw in the towel early, so to speak, and live like this the moment they get their own place. Many plan on emulating the lifestyle of women in the West, citing feminism and its rise of women who do the same as their inspiration, essentially. While they speak of a pretense to progression, the Japanese government sees this as everything but progression, which adds yet another degree to the complication of their hoped-for economic and societal recovery. Of course, these two additions of herbivore men and dry fish women to the social scene didn't happen unnoticed. Their presence has definitely inspired some other archetypes, such as the carnivore men and women, the hyper-traditionalists, the so-called high-stakes women, and the amusing gaijin hunters, who are women who exclusively search for non-Japanese men to find relationships both long-term and short-term. It would seem that Japan is indeed in a position where it's going to be forced to seriously invite immigration on a much greater level to offset the problems it's facing, or enact heavy, exacting laws on the population to force compliance with regards to population growth. Given that the latter is very unlikely, the former seems to be an inevitability. On all accounts, I advise you take this into consideration. In other words, what a strange way to describe a patriarchy. Unless, of course. Well, perhaps that could be another video, but in the meantime, this has been the Nameless Protagonist.